Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank SteelOrbis and IREPAS for this invitation for this conference, and I'd also like to thank Mr. Eldimas for this kind introduction. I suppose that most of you do not know me. I haven't been speaking at this kind of events previously. Let me briefly introduce you to ECIPE, the institutions that I am affiliated with. ECIPE is a pro-market, pro-free trade think tank. We are based in Brussels. You can compare us to, for example, the American Enterprise Institute, which is based in Washington, D.C., the Peterson Institute for International Economics. What distinguishes us from these guys in the US is that we are much smaller, and we are based in Brussels, and there's not that much of a pro-trade, pro-limited government audience, which probably explains why we haven't been so successful in the past to avoid these protectionist tendencies that pretty much everybody here in this room observes. We focus a lot on regulatory policy making, not only trade policy, but also regulations within the countries of the European Union. We do a lot on trade policy that affects services trade, digital services trade in particular. We haven't done so much in the past on steel and the trade of iron and steel products, but nevertheless, I see many commonalities between the protectionist tendencies in the steel industry and other sectors of the economy. And I think I can give you a good account of where I see major patterns in steel protectionism and also major patterns in international steel trade. So first of all, when we look at the volume of what's actually being traded in iron and steel products, we see that iron and steel, the HS72 classification according to the harmonized system, which structures trade according to different sectors of the economy, shows that only 2% of international commodity trade is actually trade in iron and steel products. So that number appears to be very small, and it appears to be much smaller if we take into account services trade, which is not being represented here. But it is still accounting for more than 400 billion in total imports or exports, respectively, per year. There are other sectors of the economy that show more trade, more value added, but we should bear in mind that steel is very often at the root of the value chains of our sectors. It's a very important input to other products in the construction sector, which accounts for much of the economic output in pretty much every economy, but also machinery and other sectors of the economy. We recently observed many protectionisms in this world. It's not only the protectionism that popped up in the United States 1.5 years ago, it's also protectionisms that we see in many other economies, or protections applied by many other governments across the world. I will come back to this in a minute. For example, we see many trade restrictive measures popping up in the past 10 years, and we also see a rise in the momentum of protectionism globally after 2014. We see countries like Mexico, South Africa, India, and Turkey that applied import tariffs on a very wide range of iron and steel products, with tariffs ranging between MER2 and 40%. We see governments of India, but also China and the US applying anti-dumping tariffs on some particular groups of commodities in iron and steel of almost 300%. So this protectionism is not something new. It happened over time, and it can have quite substantial implications for certain sectors among the iron and steel industry. There are many products covered. There are other trade restrictive measures than tariffs, for example, minimum import prices, policies that have recently been applied in India, but also the development of so-called national standards for certain subcategories in the iron and steel industry as recently applied by the government of India, and we see a spread in local content requirements in government's public procurement programs, and that's to the largest extent in the United States. Another good indicator of the rise in protectionist tendencies across the world is, for example, investigations for the sake of imposing trade defense instruments. If you look at the period 2011 to 2013, the number of investigations was about 77 per year. It increased to 117 for the period 2015 and 16, and we still see ongoing investigations more recently. What we currently observe in terms of protectionist tendencies with respect to the iron and steel sector, we can see that it didn't happen all of a sudden. It happened because we've seen protectionist sparks pretty much everywhere in the world for a pretty long time. Here I show you numbers for interventions that are considered either liberalizing or harmful by the researchers of Global Trade Alert. And we can see a very substantial rise in harmful trade restrictive policies for the iron and steel sector since 2009. At the same time, we have little momentum in terms of liberalization. I shall add that there are similar numbers that are being published by the WTO, but I recommend you to go for Global Trade Alert because these guys are really independent. If someone from a company or a government is going to the WTO to notify a certain trade restrictive measure, then the WTO officials usually approach the governments behind these measures, and the governments behind these measures then say, hey, well, look, there are our governments imposing the same restrictions, so you should not consider this a trade restrictive barrier. And then this leads to reports published by the WTO that miss a great part of the trade restrictive, trade barrier picture. Here I show you the number of interventions by governments, represented by the red bars on the bottom of the slide, and I show you the number of interventions by type of intervention. So we can see that the US was actually very trade restrictive in the past 10 years or so. And when we look at it globally and look at the types of interventions, we find that public procurement, local content requirements account for most of the trade restrictive policies, followed by import tariffs, anti-dumping measures, trade export incentives, subsidies basically, but also implied subsidies through state loans. The steel and iron sector has always been a favorite sector for governments to interfere in. It ranks on the top of all restrictive measures when you classify them by sector. Flat-rolled products being among those products that have been exposed to the greatest number of trade restrictive measures, but also the rebar sector has been targeted by governments across the world. I show a number of subsectors for the rebar industries and that are expressed by the red rectangle. So there are already numerous policies in place to protect national, domestic suppliers from competition from abroad, irrespective of whether it is considered fair or unfair. Now, let me give you a brief account of what happened in the past 5 years in terms of global imports and exports. The organizers asked me to provide a comparison between the top 10 importers and top 10 exporters for the last 5 years. And here we can see whether the protectionist tendencies actually had an impact or not, although I shall say that it is very difficult to disentangle the impacts of protectionism from other trends in capacity building, general supply, and obviously demand as well. So when we look at the numbers for the iron and steel industry on an aggregate, we can see that global imports and exports respectively increased by between 2 to 3% between 2014 and 2018. The top exporters, but also the top importers, which are shown on that slide, haven't changed much. The composition is largely the same. When we look at iron and ore, a very important input, obviously, in the value chain of iron and steel products, we see a rise of about 9 to 10% between 2014 and 2018 in terms of global exports. And at the same time, we do not see much of a change in the composition of the top suppliers of iron and ore. And we do not see much of a change in the composition of the countries that are the largest importers of iron and ore. The same is pretty much true for coke and semi-coke. An increase, there has been a lack of data for 2014, which is why I cannot plot the total growth rate between 2014 and 2018. But the market is still, the market volume has, I think, slightly increased, and we do not observe a change in the composition of the top 10 exporters naturally. And at the same time, we do not see a change in the composition of top 10 importers of coke and semi-coke products, even though on aggregate we see a rise in world trade by about 15%, which is to some extent, of course, in line with the expansion of total capacities in the iron and steel industry. Scrap. We've seen a slight decline in total exports of scrap. At the same time, there has not been much of a change in the composition of top 10 exporters in the iron and scrap market. And the same is true for imports of iron and scrap. With one exception, China has been among the top importers in 2014. It is now not in the top 10 importers anymore. Has been replaced by the United States, which compared to 2014 show a pretty significant increase in the tonnage of imported waste and scrap. For semi-finished products in the HS7207 category, we, as the previous speakers outlined, we see a general increase in trade, about 12% over the 5-year period 2014 to 2018, with Iran turning out to be one of the major exporters in 2018. Imports have increased as well. I shall probably say that there's differences between imports and exports, accounting differences. Some observers say there are some companies exporting to Mars. Others say that the accounting differences are because of companies under-declaring their exports while over-declaring their imports for financial and fiscal reasons, obviously. So what we see for imports in semi-finished products, a slight increase. At the same time, there have been two countries where companies turned out to be major importers now, the Philippines and Belgium. For the subcategory of semi-finished products, HS720711, we see a very substantial increase in trade flows. and also a change in the composition of the world's top exporters, with Iran, India, Saudi Arabia, and Vietnam showing substantial increases in exports. The landscape for imports also changed. Here we see the Philippines, the United Arab Emirates, Algeria, Tunisia, and Bulgaria now being among the top 10 importers for this particular product group. Similarly, for HS 720711, we see change in the composition of top 10 exporters, with Brazil, Japan, Kazakhstan, Turkey now being among the top 10 exporters, and Germany showing a pretty significant decrease in exports, and Oman also in the top 10 compared to 2014. This is exports of bars and rods according to the HS 7213 category. Here we see quite a significant rise again for this particular commodity group, and some change in the composition of top exporters, with now Turkey, Belgium, and also the Czech Republic being among the top 10 exporters. Imports increased at around the same level, even though we do not have quantity numbers for imports, need to refer to export numbers. And again, for this group, we also see a quite substantial change in the composition of top 10 importers. And finally, for the HS 7-14 product category, we don't have numbers for world trade in terms of quantity, but we see quite a substantial, well, not that much of a substantial change, but some change in the composition of top 10 exporters, and also some change in the composition of the top 10 importers. So now, what are the impacts of protectionism? I do not have access to industry intelligence, so I can't give you a precise account of the impacts of protectionism based on the data that I have. I can't offer you the same level of detail as Yervi Jin just did. But I can give you a broader assessment, and also expose you to some calculations on the basis of the recent safeguard quotas that have been adopted by the European Commission. Before I continue, I would like to outline a general observation, which is briefly explained by this chart. Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the man behind the tree. Many governments in this world, many government institutions, not necessarily politicians, have an intrinsic motivation, an incentive even, to adopt policies whose impacts remain opaque to ordinary citizens. Policies that are difficult to assess and analyze if you want to find out who is actually bearing the cost of a certain policy. We see that in tax policy making. Corporate taxation is one example, but we also see it in trade policy making, not only tariffs, but also other trade measures. It's very difficult to disentangle, at the end of the day, who is bearing the cost of protectionist policies. As concerns US tariffs, I would say what we currently see is a mix of, it's a policy that is based on a mix of motivations. It is, to one extent, an unavoidable collision based on what we saw in the past globally. On the other hand, it is mere economic populism. Before the Trump administration imposed its famous tariffs on steel and aluminum, there have already been 169 anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders in place. And there are still more than 25 ongoing investigations. The Trump administration, with its prominent figurehead Donald Trump, argues that, and here I'm quoting Donald Trump, that the steel and aluminum industry is vital for national security. They argue, he in particular argued several times, that 100,000 jobs have been lost in the US because of shuttered plants and mills. Millions of workers have lost employment. So this is basically the reasoning on the basis of which the Trump administration justify tariffs on imports of aluminum and steel, but also other tariffs. Now, what are the implications of these tariffs? I think it is still too early to come out with a proper assessment of the medium-term and also the long-term effects. When we look at import numbers, we see that US steel imports actually increased in 2018 from 29 to 33 billion US dollars. This is a value number, of course. I haven't looked into tonnage numbers. But we see also that year-to-date, the imports decreased by about 10% in the first 7 months of 2019. The US steel industry's overall capacity utilization rate is now at around 80%. It's slightly increased compared to previous years. And there are statistics pointing to the fact that steel makers enjoyed increased cash flows and increased profits because of higher steel prices. Last year, at the same time, we see a downward trend in the second half of 2018, and prices are still relatively volatile and have recently been in a decline in 2019. As concerns the job argument, this is, from my point of view, mere populism. Unfortunately, many people still buy the story of the Trump administration, that millions of jobs have been lost because of shuttered, closed down steel mills, and that 100,000 jobs have been lost more recently. Back in 1974, the US steel industry employed about 500,000 persons in total. The numbers came down by more than 80%, now stand at about 85,000 in the entire US steel industry. So the numbers that have been disseminated by the Trump administration are way out of proportion. They are wrong, they are outright lies. And if you apply a rule of thumb estimation calculation, you result in an estimate, a tariff revenue estimate of more than 7 billion US dollars based on the import volume, the import value of of iron and steel products in 2018. That would mean that the 2,000 jobs that have recently been added to the US iron and steel industry would have been subsidized by 3.9 million US dollar per worker. If you would believe Donald Trump's additional 100,000 job argument, which is wrong, then the subsidy would still be substantial. Now, what does this all mean for the iron and steel industry, and particular imports and exports? As we learned previously, as we learned before, there are still many protectionism, and they mainly exist because of continuing overcapacity in the steel industry. Global steelmaking capacity only marginally declined in 2018. We've seen there's a lot to expect from Southeast Asia, but I also suppose there's a lot to expect in capacity expansion from other jurisdictions in this world. The European Commission, in its recent assessment of safeguard measures, argues that in the EU we experienced a significant undercut of domestic production prices. They argue that they have found so-called undercutting, whatever this actually means, and irrespective of how it has been calculated, is still found for 17 product categories with ranges between 1 and 25%. All that also happens against the background of moderating GDP growth and low levels of economic activity, low expectations regarding the rise in economic output have always been a driver of protectionist moods everywhere in this world. As concerns the rebar markets and general trends in trade, we see that market size is going to rise with an average growth rate between of about 7% between 2025. These numbers are taken from just one source. I haven't checked the credibility of these numbers, but since the organization behind this report enjoys a certain reputation, I consider it relevant for the industry, and I know that I suppose that most of you are to some extent familiar with these numbers. They are also pretty much in line with what we can expect from aggregate GDP growth, but also growth that we see in the sector that accounts for a lot of absorption of rebar products, the construction sector, which is expected to rise in many parts of the world, particularly in emerging market economies. So we see global demand on the one hand that is expected to decrease, with certain regions in the world to be leading, like the Asia-Pacific region. At the same time, we observe a general trend towards more regionalization in imports and export. So more intra-regional trade. In the Asia-Pacific, this is largely driven by gravity, the distance between trading partners, the distance between where you build and where you sell your products. We've also seen it in the EU. After all, 50% of global trade is intra-regional trade. And I think we are likely to see it intensifying in the EU and the US as well. In the EU single market, there is naturally no tariff, and in North America, the old NAFTA partners, the new USMCA partners are also expected to trade iron and steel products at zero tariff, which will add momentum to intra-regional trade in these particular jurisdictions. Therefore, for the EU, I expect some trade diversion. I haven't estimated the size of the trade diversion effect, but I expect some trade diversion for product categories that have been or that still are subject to safeguard measures. The HS 7 to 1420 product group and HS 7 to 149910 product group, where some of the existing EU exporters are likely to absorb the export losses of non-EU suppliers. I will come back to that in a minute. At the same time, the precise impacts are, of course, difficult to estimate. There are, based on the quotas that we see for the EU, I'll also come back to this in a minute, implied tariffs that can range considerably depending on the country that's affected and the quota that is applied by the EU. And when you observe these numbers, you realize that price competition is obviously significantly distorted, but it may still be possible given the great volatility in prices that we see for some products. The EU recently imposed safeguard measures for 28 product categories. The number slightly increased compared to, I think, 1 year ago when the EU imposed temporary measures. It is applying safeguard measures to all iron and steel products, obviously covering long products as well. Several EU importers argue that that's not a good idea. It would hit the consumers, the EU consumers of iron and steel products, but the EU still concludes that safeguard measures are needed. They are in the interest of the European Union, as they would prevent any serious injury caused by a further surge in imports. As concerns rebar products, and I mentioned this earlier, the EU imposed safeguard measures for 2 product categories, the HS 171420 and the HS 721499 product group, and quotas for country-specific quotas for Turkey, Russia, Ukraine, Bosnia, Moldova, and general quota for other countries importing to the EU. It turns out that for Turkey and Russia, the quotas are much lower than the export volume of these countries in 2018. For the Ukraine, Bosnia, Moldova, it's a different story. They are not very likely to export as much as they would meet the quota and the tariff threshold, basically. When we look at import volumes of these particular product categories, we see that for the first one, we see imports of 5.4 million tonnages for the EU as an aggregate. The second one, 2.3 million, a significant rise compared to 2014. EU quotas have been calculated on the basis of 2015 to 2017 average values, so they do not necessarily reflect these trends. At a combined level, we have imports of 7.8 million tons. And when we look at the aggregate quota, which is 1.4 million tons, we see that only 18% of these products can be imported at zero tariffs in the period July 2019 to June 2020, basically in the next 11 months. And that results in an implied tariff of 20% for all imports of these products, irrespective of where they come from. When we look at country-specific quotas for Turkey or the Russian Federation, we can see that if you look at the total trade volume, that would result in an implied tariff for Turkey of 15%, at the same time for Russia of only 6%, based on 2018 trade values. So we can see that there is already a certain level of discrimination taking place, and of course this has a distortionary impact on the exporters of these countries. At the same time, we should also bear in mind that there is certain volatility in the prices for rebar products, and some companies might be able to offer lower prices to balance the adverse impact of tariffs in the EU, but also other countries our governments in this world. My conclusion, so first of all, as we've seen, steel protectionism is not a novel development. Steel trade was always subject to political fight in the past. When you look into the investigations on trade defense measures, when you look at the concept of dumping and safeguard, you realize that these concepts are vague and they offer a substantial amount of discretion for those guys who assess markets and whether there is dumping or whether there is a need to apply safeguard measures. Now these judgments, the policy instruments and the judgments based on these concepts can effectively contain economic opportunities and also economic development of countries where you find manufacturers that compete fairly, where you do not see much of government interventions, no subsidies, and so on and so forth. At the same time, trade restrictive measures are by many, including me, I shall say, considered a legitimate tool to contain imports from countries with heavy government involvement. And the obvious country that comes to the eye is China. But we should also bear in mind that protectionist measures like taxes in general, tariffs, other trade barriers are like a hydra. They create more problems than they solve. And it's very difficult for outsiders to get a clear picture about who is actually bearing the financial burden of these policy measures. In economic lingo, this is called a tax incidence. It is very, very difficult to determine. Usually, the burden is passed on to consumers, B2B and B2C, but also workers. And this is not something that you read in the media. It's not something that makes the headlines, unfortunately. And we should also bear in mind that trade restrictive measures and the trade diversion caused by these measures has knock-on effects. And it can sometimes have significant knock-on effects on other parts of the economy, downstream sectors, and their competitiveness and innovative capacities. So I would leave it with that. I hope you can use some of the statistics, some of the insights for your own estimates, for your own opinion building processes. Yeah, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Bauer. Any questions from the floor for Dr. Bauer? Here.
Hello, Dr. Bauer. Thank you for the talk. I have actually 3 points to follow up. And first, I wanted to ask for your opinion on how you actually rate the effectiveness of the EU safeguards, because we've seen actually falling rebar and longs price in general, although some of the quotas are already filled, and also during the provisional safeguards, we haven't seen price support, although we had those restrictions in place. And so the second one is, how do you actually rate and how you interpret the latest amendments the European Commission has done to the safeguard? Basically, they targeted 2 countries without specifically naming them. And the third point is, what do you think, what has to happen that Section 232 and then followed by the safeguards actually go away? And do you see that in the medium term? Thank you.
As concerns the first question on the effectiveness, I mean, you can expect that some of the motivation of US and also EU policymakers is to have a surge in prices domestically for domestic production. Obviously, that didn't happen. So I would say there's not much of evidence that points to the existence of any effectiveness in these measures, caused by these measures. The latest amendments by the European Union we need to bear in mind that lobbying in iron and steel has always been strong in the past. So this is not something that just popped up in the EU in the last 2 years or so. There are aligned interests, obviously, between some manufacturers and policy makers. As concerns the EU, tariff revenue goes directly to the EU budget. And we should bear in mind that the European Union, which is in charge of trade policy for the entire set of 28 EU member states, might not be the best institution to defend free trade. And it all comes also against the background that the UK is leaving the EU, which causes another gap in the EU's general budget. So the European Commission, which actually defended free trade in the past, is now increasingly open to demands from national member states. And now you have a scapegoat. It is the Trump administration. To a large extent, it's also China. And you can use this scapegoat and suggest and actually implement policies that cater to demands of your steel industry very well. So that would be my response to the second question. Are we going to see tariffs disappear in the near to medium future? Well, if you look at the EU measures and the regulation they are based on, There's the word permanent in the title. And after all, the safeguard measures are tariffs are taxes, and once a tax has been imposed, it is very difficult to get rid of it. In Germany, for example, we have 5 different taxes for Christmas trees. For a very long time now, nobody seems to care. And I think nobody seems to care about tariffs imposed on iron and steel products. The populations of many people don't like business, they don't like big business, but they still favor subsidies and still favor tariffs. It's somewhat of a paradox, but public opinion won't change. And as long as public opinion doesn't change and there is strong lobbying in favor of the protection of domestic industries in the US, in the EU, but also elsewhere, I think we are not going to see these policy instruments disappear in the near future. I think we won't see a fully fledged trade war between the EU and the US because there's much more at stake for the US compared to China. Exports from the US are 3 times higher than exports from the US to the EU are 3 times higher than exports from the US to China. So I think this kind of trade war will be contained by this simple fact. But as concerns tariffs on iron and steel products, I think the picture is much more dull.
I have a comment. I think the biggest casualty in this whole trade war is the World Trade Organization. And looks like the World Trade Organization's effectiveness is really coming down. And I noticed that the US is delaying the appointments of judges which really make the final decision. So it's really hurting the whole thing. But I know what the US point of view on the WTO is, but I don't know how Europe looks at WTO and how much do they want to increase the effectiveness, or they don't care at all as well.
Yeah, it's difficult to make a proper assessment about what's currently happening at the WTO. There are many parties involved naturally, and we also see this in OECD procedures about corporate tax reform. They talk to each other, but we do not really know what they are actually talking about. The US, sometimes US officials, USTR, they are not very responsive to the calls and demands of other jurisdictions. Then also the WTO it didn't turn out to be weak all of a sudden. Since 1994, when WTO was established, we haven't seen much of a liberalization effort. We've seen the defense of a rule-based system, which is a good thing. We've seen a very well-functioning dispute settlement body and dispute settlement system. That's certainly true. But I think the future of rules for global trade doesn't lie in the hands of the WTO. It's more in the hands of institutions that are in charge of enforcing the rules of regional trade agreements. Which can be an opportunity for free trade rather than a prolonged crisis.
So EU looks at WTO as a future or not?
I don't know. I think there are different voices among EU member state representatives. And finally, it's the Council that matters. Obviously, the European Commission, they are very much in favor of the WTO. It is a very mature institutional system. You know, bureaucracies are boats that turn very slowly only. So there is a certain institutional, let's say, bureaucratic commitment. The Council is also still in favor of the WTO formally, but there are many others, there are many policymakers within the member states that think about it in a different way. So I think support of the WTO might be strengthened by some, but might also see some erosion that we see by others, including the United States. And the Trump administration, I mean, they have a point. You have a set of rules for a certain set of countries. There are differences between countries that have a different state of economic development. But the preferences of these governments turn out to be very heterogeneous. And many governments feel that their scope for action is in a way stifled and in a way they do not welcome.
Thank you very much. Yeah, one more question, please. Last one.
I'm just wondering if you've looked at the tariffs that President Trump intends to put on, or said he may put on, automobile exports from Europe and auto parts. I think he's set a deadline of mid-November now for that decision, and he's pushed that back a couple of times.
Yep.
I'm just wondering what your opinion is on that, and whether how feasible you think, how likely you think that is to happen.
Yeah, we've seen in the past, as you just indicated, it is a moving deadline. I think it's not very likely that we are going to see these tariffs. The EU will obviously respond, and as I just mentioned, trade exposure, import exposure, the US import exposure to the EU is very large, much larger than we see for China. There is a lot of scope for retaliation. We've already seen lists with, Harley-Davidson motorcycles, whiskey products from the United States, sensitive industries, which will increase the domestic pressure on the Trump administration. On the other hand, we should also bear in mind that there are still substantial tariffs imposed by the EU on US cars. So there are voices observers that argue that this is just a tactic, a strategy in the negotiation for better deals in the future. All of what we have seen in terms of threats and actual measures like tariffs on iron and steel and aluminum products is just used temporary as long as the United States get a better deal in its agreements with other jurisdictions, including the EU, but also Japan and China, for which we see conversation and negotiations right now. So this adds another element of uncertainty to this entire debate, and it obviously doesn't make choice easier for the manufacturers, which have to plan their commercial activities and their investments for the next years.
Thank you very much. I believe there are no more questions, so thank you very much, Dr. Bauer.
Thank you.
It's a very nice presentation.